The Cold War. The Cold War began in 1945 and ended in 1989. The Cold War means a war of ideas, so there was no firepower involved. It was between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, so it all boiled down to democracy versus communism. At the end of World War II, everyone was looking for peace and harmony throughout the whole world, but that depended largely upon some sort of agreement between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The U.S. felt the need to spread their influence on the world because they had actually prospered from World War II, unlike France and Great Britain. In 1944, in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, 44 nations met to create the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. This was meant to help rebuild war-torn and devastated Europe. The Soviet Union refused to ratify the proposals because they would enable the U.S. to rebuild the world as capitalist. This led to the isolation of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Also, the Soviet Union wanted to re-establish its 1941 borders, and by the time Potsdam rolled around, they had extended their territory, which meant that most of Eastern Europe was under their control and being supported by them alone. Then, Germany was divided up at the Yalta Conference. Eventually, the French, British, and American zones merged, but the Soviet Union did not participate in this merge. They did not want to create a stronger Germany because it would be a threat. In basic terms, the Cold War was partially caused by the breaking down of alliances from World War II because of underlying differences in beliefs. It boiled down to the extreme differences in American and Soviet beliefs. In addition, the power-hungry Stalin was being continuously angered. As far as the causes of the Cold War go, this list is much easier to understand. The U.S.'s foreign policy began containment, which sought to contain communism to where it was. So, basically, the U.S. was preventing the spread of communism, but leaving it alone where it already existed. The Truman Doctrine was a policy to provide aid to free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. It was immediately aimed at stabilizing Turkey and Greece, but agreed to fight the spread of communism worldwide. The Federal Employees Loyalty and Security Program prohibited communists and fascists from federal employment and outlined procedures for investigating current and prospective federal employees. The Marshall Plan gave European nations aid to rebuild their economies. The National Security Act created the Department of Defense, National Security Council, and the CIA. The Smith-Mundt Act launched overseas campaigns of anti-communist propaganda. NATO reintroduced the idea of collective security. The Psychological Strategies Board provided more anti-communist propaganda. The Internal Security Act required the registration of all communist and totalitarian groups and authorized the arrest of suspect persons during a national emergency. The Immigration and Nationality Act reaffirmed the national origins quota system, but made it tighter, including restrictions on homosexuals and other subversive people. The Taft-Hartley Act limited unions' powers. The Berlin Blockade was put in place by the Soviet Union to cut West Berlin off from West Germany. When this wall was created, it isolated West Berlin from any type of supplies and surrounded it with hostile forces. So the U.S. provided West Berlin with supplies by air, which was called the Berlin Airlift. In 1949, despite the U.S.'s support of Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese nationalists, China buckled under the pressure of Mao Zedong and the Communists. The Korean War was also called the Forgotten War. After World War II, Korea was split along the 38th parallel, and the Communist North Korea invaded South Korea. The U.S. enlisted UN support, and a tug-of-war ensued from 1950 to 1953. An armistice was called, and the fighting stopped, but the war was not technically over. There is still a demilitarized zone that is owned by nobody, but is constantly patrolled on both sides. This was the first time U.S. troops were sent into a war zone without declaration. This also created the idea of limited war, where if one country holds the line and stops the spread of communism, then they ultimately win. The Vietnam War began in 1954, but didn't end until 1975. It was ultimately caused by containment, communism, and the military-industrial complex. It introduced the domino theory, which means if one country falls to communism, they all will. It was also the first televised war. The French originally owned Vietnam, but after World War II, the French had to relinquish it and Japan gained control. Then Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam independent and kicked the Japanese out. The U.S. faced an internal conflict because they do not want to support French colonialism, but they also do not want to support Vietnamese communism. Eventually, they backed the French. General MacArthur was in charge of Japan after World War II. He helped set it up as a democracy and ally of the U.S. He also helped to provide Japan with a huge reform and a new constitution. However, he angered many people in D.C. by acquiring too much power and forgiving war crimes that he did not have full authority over. The Eisenhower Doctrine was essentially the same as the Truman Doctrine, except in the Middle East. Eisenhower wanted to work behind the scenes and reduce tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. He authorized CIA covert affairs in Guatemala and Iran. He also made France and Great Britain retreat from Egypt. He warned against the military-industrial complex, and he supported mutually assured destruction. Kennedy was entirely different from Eisenhower in the realm of politics. He castigated Eisenhower for allowing communism to continue in Cuba so close to the U.S. Kennedy also criticized his predecessor for solely supporting MAD instead of broadening the U.S.'s horizons. He generally favored flexible options, ranging from limited conventional war to limited nuclear war to nuclear holocaust. McCarthyism is a tactic of damaging reputations with unfounded charges. McCarthy was one man on a witch hunt for communists. Eventually, he accused the army of being communist, which discredited him. The House of Un-American Activities investigated communist subversion in government. It was originally created to investigate communism in Hollywood. It eventually led to the Alger Hiss case, in which Hiss was ultimately convicted of perjury, not treason. The Cold War shaped society in the future, like creating the fear of communism that led to the conformity of the 50s. Then, the backlash of the 60s and 70s was a result of the radical conformity of the 50s. In addition, the Cold War changed society at the time, such as how kids were participating in air raid drills at schools and taking home instructions on how to build a fallout shelter in their backyards.